Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Caleb Likes Books. Today I'm going to be doing a full book series review, and that is going to be for the Deltora Quest series by Emily Rodda. This is a children's fantasy series that I read as a kid alongside the Chronicles of Narnia. This was kind of the main fantasy series that I was into growing up, and I reread it many times as a kid, and I hadn't read it in at least a decade, probably a bit more than that. And so I figured I would reread it over the course of the last couple weeks. I knocked out a few of the books just within the span of a few days, and then I waited about a week and a half because I read another book in that time, and then I knocked out the last few over these last couple days. So I've reread all of them recently, and I'm going to give you my thoughts. As far as the books in this series, it is an 8-book series. I have all of them right here, and I'm just going to show you each of them real quick. So the first one is The Forest of Silence, Book 2, The Lake of Tears. Book 3, which is the first one I read, The City of the Rats. This is the first one I read when I was a kid. Book 4, The Shifting Sands. This is getting difficult. Book 5, what's it called? The Dread Mountain. That's it. I couldn't remember. And then Book 6, The Maze of the Beast. Book 7, The Valley of the Lost. And Book 8, Return to Del. So this series is about a few different characters. The main POV character is named Leaf, and he goes on this quest with a couple of friends named Barda and Jasmine who accompany him throughout the series. And basically the premise of this series is that the land of Deltora is this magical land and everything, but it was taken over by the Shadow Lord some years back, 15-20 years back. And the Belt of Deltora, which is this magical belt that has a whole bunch of gemstones in it, which you can actually see on the spines of the books. There, those little circle, or not circle, the oval looking things, those are all the gemstones in the belt. They were scattered across the land, and in order for the Shadow Lord to be banished from the land and everything to go back to being really cool and awesome, the heir of the king needs to be found, and the belt needs to be restored so all the gems need to be found and put back in the belt, and then that needs to be given to the heir to the throne, and then they can restore Deltora to its former glory or whatever. That's basically the premise of this book. So you have Leaf, Barda, and Jasmine going all across this land to different places and facing different perils, facing enemies or different like puzzle type things, like riddles or trials or things like that, coming across some very interesting characters, and eventually getting to this place where the gem is, fighting or outsmarting or whatever is guarding it, and then take it and move on to the next place. So that's basically the premise of the series in general. So to start talking about each of these books, the way I'm going to format this is I'm just going to talk very briefly about each book because they're short. I don't have a lot to say about each one, and then give my overall thoughts on the series afterwards. So first, we have The Forest of Silence, which has one of my favorite covers. I would like to get the hardcover. There's a hardcover bind-up of all these books that I would like to get, but the original covers on the paperbacks do look very nice. They have some very cool artwork on them. But The Forest of Silence is the first book. It's the setup for the entire series. Basically, half of this book, the first half, is kind of backstory, when the king and his friend were growing up, and then also when the Shadow Lord takes over. It's kind of split into those couple of parts. I think, if I remember correctly, it's been, a couple of weeks since I've read this, so I can't remember entirely, but it's back around the time when all these stuff was starting to happen. Shadow Lord takes over, the king escapes, and all this stuff, and things just kind of start going badly. And then there's a time jump of 15-20 years, I think actually 16 years, because Leaf is 16 years old. He is given this quest by his parents, who now are like, okay, you need to go do this quest. And he and Barda, who is someone that his parents knew, go off to the Forest of Silence to find the first gemstone for the Belt of Deltora. And along the way, they meet Jasmine as well, who joins their party. This book was a really good setup. I felt like the actual beginning of the quest was a little rushed because half of this book is basically backstory, and then only the second half is actually like beginning Leaf's story. So it does feel a little rushed, I think. And these books are not long. They're only 125, 130 pages each, and the print in them is not that small. So not a whole lot to work with in terms of length. So it did feel a little rushed to me. But I did really love the setup in this book. Like the backstory stuff was really good, really enjoyable. Probably one of the better books in the series, I would say. It's not quite one of my favorites, but it's, on the upper half, if I were to put it that way. Really good setup for the series. It does a good job of starting the quest, which the quest is very tropey, of course. You've got the Dark Lord, you've got the person who has this ancient magical item that they need to go and find or whatever, finding all the gemstones and all this stuff, which are then going to repel the big evil Dark Lord or whatever. So this is a very tropey story for sure, but I think it does it very well, sets it up nicely, and it's a pretty solid book. Then next we have The Lake of Tears, which is the second book. So in this one, they have to go to the Lake of Tears to get the second gemstone. This one I think is one of, if not the weakest book in the series. I'd probably say it's my second least favorite. It's still good. It's generally an enjoyable book, but a lot of the other ones I think just had more unique qualities to them that really stood out to me. This one has some interesting encounters with some interesting enemies that I really enjoyed, but otherwise it's just, it's okay. It's a significant step down from the first book, I think, which was a great setup and was really enjoyable. This one's just, in comparison, is just okay. It's enjoyable, but I didn't really love it quite as much, but there's some good character stuff in there, and none of the characters across the series get super developed, because it is a kid's series. They're not long books, so there's not a whole lot of room for a huge amount of development, but their interactions in this are good, and there's some good stuff in here, but it's one of the weaker books, I would say. Third book, The City of the Rats. As I said, this was the first one that I read as a kid. I saw it in the kind of books that my teacher had in my homeroom in my third grade class, I want to say. And I saw this and I was like, oh, that looks cool. So I started reading it and I really enjoyed it. And then I got the whole series. This, again, kind of similar to the first book, is one of the better books, I would say. It's probably, I would say, my third favorite book in the series. It was really enjoyable. There's a lot of cool world building in here. The gang has to go to the City of the Rats, as you would assume by the title. And the world building of the places that they end up in this book is really interesting. Good character interactions, all that stuff. Like I said, I don't have a lot to say about each of these books, but I did really enjoy the world building in this one. The places that they end up have some interesting stuff going on in them that I quite enjoyed. And yeah, this was another really good one. Book 4, The Shifting Sands. Now, this is a weird one, because going into this is one of the few books in the series I didn't really remember much about. This one, the next book, and I would say the next 3 books, this book and the next 2 after it. I didn't remember a whole lot about going into them again, but this actually turned out to be my favorite of the bunch. I really enjoyed this a lot. They end up in this kind of desert area. They end up in this town where they have to do kind of this, not quite gladiatorial arena style thing, but something very similar. They have to fight in order to get this prize and all this stuff, which was really cool. Really enjoyed the setting. There was some interesting conflicts going on in this book as well, between, the party and all the stuff that they're having to do. And I really enjoyed this one a lot. Like I said, this is probably my favorite of the series. And I also just, I think it did a good job world building. It had some interesting conflicts going on, all of that stuff. And this book is actually where some of the connections to previous books start to come in a little bit. It's not really that much, but like this book has some stuff in it that does play a big role later in the series, which is cool. Doesn't quite come in by this point, but it starts kind of building that, connecting everything together a little more. Next one is book 5, which is Dread Mountain. This is my least favorite book in the series, unfortunately. Not by like a whole lot. Like, I enjoyed all the books in this series, but this one is my least favorite. There is some cool world building here. They get kind of into the situation with some gnomes, which is kind of interesting. But overall, this one was just okay, I thought. Some good stuff here and there for sure. But this one was just okay. Then we have book 6, which is The Maze of the Beast. This one also was pretty good. This is probably more in the middle for me. I would say out of the bunch, if I'm thinking of it, it's probably like my fifth favorite or something. This was pretty good. Not really much really stood out to me as being really excellent, but it did, again, start to kind of build that connecting to previous books. This one especially really kind of starts that. It kind of starts tying things together, brings back old characters, all that stuff, aside from obviously the main team. But it brings back some old characters from previous books and all that stuff. Starts kind of connecting things together, which I did enjoy. Yeah, generally this was a solid one. Didn't absolutely love it, but it was good. Then we have book 7, Valley of the Lost. This one, to my memory, was my favorite as a kid, and I would say it is one of my favorite ones even now. I don't think it's my favorite. It's probably like top 3, I would say. But it was really good. There was, again, some really cool, this was a more unique one. Each of these books has some unique qualities to them, but this one I felt was one of the more unique ones because there's some really interesting conflict stuff going on in it, lots of interesting reveals, as well with some of the world building. Again, building on the previous books, there's stuff in here that directly ties into past books, especially I would say the first book and the Shifting Sands, kind of building on what was in the last book that connected, and then also connecting some other stuff. It was really, really cool. And then a lot of the other, basically all of the other encounters with the Guardians of the Gemstones, aside from the first book was maybe a little more similar to this one, although that also ended up in a fight. But all the other ones basically ended up with the team either having to outsmart them or get in some kind of conflict or something. This one actually is more of a riddle. They have to complete this riddle, which is actually quite interesting, I think, in order to get the gemstone. And I enjoyed that a lot. The answer to the riddle was interesting, and all that stuff. Just generally a really interesting book. This is one of the ones where, it was my favorite as a kid, but I didn't really remember much about it. So it was really interesting to go back to it. And then we have the final book, Return to Del. This is, again, one of my favorites in the series. I would say this is probably my second favorite book. I really enjoyed this one a lot. The only thing that brought it down was, I think, the beginning of it was not quite as interesting, but the rest of it was really good. The thing I loved about this book was, again, kind of similar to the last several books, how it kind of ties everything together. This really makes the series feel very cohesive, because early on, the first few books, they feel kind of much more episodic, I guess. There's not a whole lot of through lines between each of them. Obviously, you have the main characters, but otherwise, there's not many reappearing characters or reappearing plot lines or things like that, whereas these last few books have started to kind of weave things together. This one really does. Brings in several characters from past books, really kind of reflects on the whole series and kind of goes like, okay, we visited all of these different places. This is how, all of that matters now and everything. Relates very heavily back to the first book as well. There are some things that were set up in the first book that are directly paid off in this book, and all that stuff, and it's a very good resolution to the story. I do think the resolution comes a little quickly, and I could probably say that with most of the books in this series, but that's more so, I think, a factor because they're so short. But this was really enjoyable. It was, like I said, probably my second favorite in the series. Really enjoyed it a lot. Very solid conclusion. So my overall thoughts on this series are quite positive now, having reread it. This was one of those situations where it's like, you read something as a kid, or you watch something, or you play a video game, or whatever it may be when you're a kid, and you're like, oh, this is awesome, and then you revisit it several years later, and you're kind of afraid that it's not very good anymore. And I had that feeling with this series. I was like, oh, I hope it's good still. I hope I still enjoy it. And I'm happy to say I really did. Like I said, character development and things like that are not huge in this series. There is some for sure, like you get some conflict between characters early on, and they kind of learn to kind of appreciate each other more and things like that. And things like that. There definitely is some development for sure. and some interesting world building. I enjoyed the world building in the series, even though, again, because it's a children's series, it is fairly minimal. But I did enjoy the world building here. It's an interesting world. It's even though it is very tropey in a lot of ways, it has its unique qualities to it. Some unique creatures, unique locations, different things like that. Really enjoyed the world building. And, you know, it's just a fun adventure, you know? You read each of these books and you feel like you got a fun little adventure to go on, and then looking back on the series as a whole, you see how everything kind of relates together and all that stuff, and it was really enjoyable. And I would say, if you're wondering if you are maybe interested in this series, or if you're maybe even hearing me talk about it now for the first time because you're just subscribed to the channel and you're watching it or whatever, and you're wondering if it's worth it to read these, I would say that it is. You know, I don't think it's a series that will absolutely blow you away, because, you know, for me, even though I really enjoyed it, it's not like one of my favorite series of all time or anything. But if you're interested in a fairly, you know, simple, easy, light series to read, then this is a good one to go for. Quite enjoyable. There's also some follow-up series as well. There's another trilogy plus another set of 4 books, which I've read most of those. I don't think I read all of them when I was a kid, but I'd like to read them again. And so there's even more in this world that you can experience. Plus there are some other series as well that I have not even touched. But I guess there's some other series in this same world as well. So there's a lot to get into when it comes to this series. But I would recommend reading it. It's a good series. But anyways, that is pretty much it for this video. So let me know down in the comments if you have read Deltora Quest and what you thought of it, if so, or if you maybe have never heard of this series, because I have not heard a ton about this series, just within fantasy circles and things like that. So I feel it is a little underrated. You know, certainly worth checking out if you have not heard of it before and all of that stuff. So let me know down in the comments if you've read it, or if you've never heard of it and now you're interested in it or whatever. Definitely a good one, I think, for kids to read as well. You know, if you have kids or whatever, you know, I think like elementary school age, you know, they can certainly get into this. So let me know all that stuff down in the comments, and that is pretty much it for this video. So thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys next time.